as we all know, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle during 2020. You know, that teeny, tiny global pandemic. We were all stuck in our homes, safely social distancing, picking up new hobbies or rekindling our loves for old ones. A couple of my favorite hobbies were lying around all day and doing nothing. Then after a few hours, hating myself for doing so. As fun as this self-serving cycle of self-loathing was, by far my favorite new hobby that I picked up during the pandemic has been baking. Now, I've always loved to bake, but starting in April, I've baked more than I ever have before, as did almost everyone else, once they got tired of watching Tiger King and feeling public hatred for Carol Baskin, who absolutely killed her husband and fed him to her tigers. In all seriousness, this pandemic has put life in perspective, making us realize what is truly important. Carbs and sugar! So today, we will whisk together the history of baking, fold in my experiences with it, before finally sifting together what we can all learn from baking. Baking was most likely one of the first types of food preparation ever created. It was most likely added into the human skill set shortly after the creation of fire and the advent of agriculture. Many ancient farming villages grew corn and wheat, making them virtually indistinguishable from much of Nebraska. And fire was spreading through ancient farming communities like, well, wildfire. It was like the iPhone of 2500 BC. And since ancient communities had wheat, they had corn, then they had baking and meat. This means that the first ever baked good was probably a beef Wellington. And if you don't know, a beef Wellington is kind of like a runza, but significantly worse. Now, beef probably wasn't the main ingredient. Maybe it was a woolly mammoth Wellington. A woolly Wellington, if you will. In all seriousness, woolly Wellingtons were not the first baked goods. They were flatbreads, which, in my opinion, have none of the appeal of a woolly Wellington. Now, ancient bakers just took lumps of dough and laid them out on a hot surface and waited for anything to happen, which is, coincidentally enough, my approach to hot yoga. Now, flatbreads are boring, so let's make like Peter Pan and fly onto the state of current baking. Baking has become commercialized. Most people buy pre-made baked goods, and while some may argue that this commercialization is the best thing since sliced bread, others would say that it single-handedly destroyed a cottage industry. Baking is more of an art form that is a way of subsistence nowadays. So I'd like to take this chance to unveil my masterpiece. I call him Gregory. Isn't he gorgeous? It's a self-portrait, you know. Isn't the resemblance uncanny? No? Okay, fine. We've all learned a lot during this point. We've all learned about the history of baking, and I've learned that you all have no appreciation for true art. So, let's move on and look at my experiences with baking. I learned to bake from 2 teachers, but it was complicated because they were mortal enemies. I'm talking about my boomer grandmother and the internet. I spent a lot of time in the kitchen with my grandmother when I was a little kid. From her, I learned some of my favorite recipes, like my great-great-grandmother's Christmas cookies and my great-grandmother's bread. But I've also taught her recipes from the internet. One of my favorite recipes, mandazis, or Kenyan fried flatbreads, I found on the internet, and I shared it with her immediately. We made them as quickly as we could, even sharing with my grandfather, who loved them, which is kind of surprising considering that my grandfather is the type of man who considers sweet and sour chicken, essentially chicken nuggets from Hy-Vee, to be exotic, authentic cuisine. And as great as mandazis are, by far my favorite thing that I have ever baked was my 16th birthday cake. It was glorious. a rainbow of colors of vanilla cakes, frosted with a homemade strawberry whipped cream, the perfect cross-section. In fact, everyone in my family loved the cross-section alone. I mean, this is what they saw. But unfortunately, thanks to my color blindness, this is the cross-section I got. And with a cake this beautiful, I had to send a picture to my grandmother. She loved it, and she texted back, "Noah, I support you." My grandmother thought that this rainbow cake was my way of coming out. And as heartwarming as her acceptance of me was, I'm straight. So now we all know a little bit too much about me. Let's look at what we can all learn from baking. In 2013, Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado went to the Supreme Court over their refusal to sell a gay couple a cake. They said that it was due to their religious beliefs, calling gay marriage an abomination. Now, they won their Supreme Court case. A true law and order. Cake order, that is. They won, giving them the ability to deny their customer service based on their religious beliefs. And while they had a victory here, they did not win the war. Their orders have quickly dwindled over time, showing that freedom of speech is not freedom of consequence. From baking, we can also learn that love is love, cake is cake. It's not at all political, it's just baking. We can also learn that vanilla extract tastes bad on its own, and that white powders are good. And of course, we all know what I mean by white powders. That's right, say it with me. Crack cocaine. No, I'm just kidding. Sugar is the only thing that I have a crippling addiction to. The outrage that this bakery felt simply for this couple's existence is somewhat ironic, given that rage baking exists as a social phenomenon. People will bake cakes and cookies and breads as a way to cope with their emotions, giving them a positive outlet for their bottled up emotions. And once they're done expressing themselves, they have two options. They can either eat their feelings or enjoy their nice, fresh, warm, homemade punching bag. From rage baking, we can learn that it's important to have positive ways to deal with our emotions, and that punching cakes should not be one of those. So today, we flipped open our metaphorical cookbook to uncover the history of baking, page through my experiences with it, and finally, highlight what we can learn from baking. Baking is about sharing. Baking is about coming together over a communal dish, which is something we can all do right now because no one has ever gotten sick from sharing food. But in all seriousness, baking is about coming together. So, let's spread these messages and go forth and be as kind and welcoming to each other as a nice, fresh, woolly Wellington.